For this session, I'm really happy to introduce Maria Pastorelli, an intercultural coach and owner of Bridge Consulting, ACC credentialed coach who lives in Shanghai and has been there for the past 10, 13 years or so. Is that correct?
13 and counting.
Beautiful. So the goal of this session today is to talk about intercultural coaching as a coaching niche. And I've always had curiosity in this area, partially because I personally work around intercultural leadership and team and relocation and all these areas, partially because our coaches in training are not sure about what different niches they can pick when they start working with clients. And I think that a lot of people are looking at their professional background when they pick their interests, but not many people look at their life experiences when they pick their niches. And a lot of our coaches in training are expats in China. So intercultural communication is such a big part of our day-to-day life, and it can become a very good coaching niche, which is very much in demand from what I'm observing. Yeah, so just wanted to have Maria here to talk about this more, to see what is possible for a coach to do in the intercultural area, what kind of requests clients come with, and how you can make a difference as an intercultural coach. Would you provide a bit of background about yourself, Maria?
Of course. So first, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk all things cross-culture and coaching. So as Luba was mentioning, I've been in China for the past 13 years, and I came here after my cross-cultural communication degree. Originally, I came to China for only 6 months, for a 6 months Chinese course at Fudan University. And like many people who came to China for a short assignment, whether it was study or work, I ended up extending it year by year, and then 13 years later, I'm still here. So now what I do is the majority of my work is around intercultural leadership, cross-cultural collaborations between teams, mostly within China and Asia Pacific and Europe. However, I do have clients from other areas as well, but that is the bigger areas that I focus on, although because also I'm Italian, so I do have a lot more European lived experience, and also most of my clients gravitate towards that area. And having lived in China, having worked with China, North Asia, and Asia Pacific in general, that is also where a lot of the clients kind of gravitate around. So that's what I do, and I'm always learning, and I'm very happy to talk more about maybe a little bit more details about what happens when we talk about intercultural communication and leadership.
Definitely. So you mentioned this intercultural leadership, and could you unpack this a little bit for us?
Well, working with companies and teams and leaders, it always comes down to people working with people. And working as a foreigner in China, there's often the understanding that leadership is different in different places, right? And so often clients come to me, or I have conversations with potential clients, and there's always this idea that China is a very complex place, and also people do things quite differently compared to other areas. So in the past, let's say 20 to 15 years, it was very common for managers and leaders from Europe and North America to come to China to either start a subsidiary of a company or lead a new team or start a completely new project, and they will have to work with a mainly local Chinese team. Now, in the past 5 and 3 years, that trend has changed, as in there's generally fewer people coming here for longer terms, and also there's a lot of exchange the other way. So there's a lot of leaders from China, from Asia Pacific, going to Europe and North America. So the idea that leaders need to adapt to a different environment, that is often the start of conversations around leadership and collaboration, because I think there's a common understanding that when you move country, you do need to understand how things work in that particular country. So that's usually the starting point.
Interesting. And so what may be some typical requests that are common in the intercultural leadership area?
Is usually around being new to the country, and usually the requests are around what is common in China when it comes to being a leader. What things should leader look for when manage a team in China, or vice versa? What if a Chinese leader or a leader that has been in Asia Pacific for a long time, they are going to Europe, although Europe is a big place and it's really hard to say European ways, but just generally a more European context, right? So there are things that can be different. So usually the requests are around like tips or like a point of view about what is common in that particular area, so that people have a base to learn from. In my experience, sometimes the requests can be quite simplistic, because sometimes a lot of clients do feel that they need 10 bullet points of things to look for, and that's probably good enough for them. And usually during the work, either with individual coaching or group coaching or training that happens before or after the coaching, we find out that usually knowing 10 things that you should or should not do in a country is barely even scratching the surface. If not, those things can be good to know, but they're not really what is going to change the way that people lead and work in a different country.
That makes total sense. Just thinking back of some of the recent coaching topics that I coach around that are in the intercultural area, something I heard from clients was, how do I bond with a new team when I'm not so familiar with a culture and I'm a newcomer? How do I give feedback without offending someone? How will something be perceived? So in my country, it's very typical if I do this. So how can I do this in a new culture with a new team, right? So
I feel something that comes across very, very strongly often is leaders that come again from a European or American background that come to China, and one of their first, maybe they've been here a couple of months, and that's maybe where we have starting our coaching journey, and often is, how do I get my team to speak up? How do I get people to give me feedback? Why, when I ask a question in a meeting, everybody says, yeah, everything's fine, and then I find out 3 days later that nothing is fine, and people are not ready to do whatever they said they were going to do. And that comes up over and over again. And from their perspective, I understand how frustrating that can be, because there's two very, very different ways of looking at silence as saying yes, at commitment, and what is needed for people to actually being able to do the work. So it is one of the big frustrations that often people voice in their experiences when they come this side of the world.
Right. So can success of intercultural coaching be measured? In coaching, there are so many conversations about measuring the ROI of coaching, and how can we define if this coaching intervention was helpful or not? So speaking of intercultural coaching, what is seen as success by clients?
I think there's two things around success, and of course that differs for every leader, every team defines success in a different way. But I think there's two things that clients and leaders often see as success. One is more on the people relationship side, because often there is a disconnect or there is a lack of bonding, a lack of interesting relationship. So there is very much like a distance between the leader and the team, and the transformation of that relationship into a not necessarily friendship relationship, but definitely a more productive, more natural, more discussion-based relationship. That is definitely something that a lot of leaders are looking to achieve. And on the other side, there is the more content / KPI driven, as in often a team that is not cohesive, a team that is not responding to a particular leadership style, a team that is not working well together is struggling to achieve their KPIs. And so that is another way that leaders often want to see changes in, as in they want to see their performance improve. They want to see the number of incidents in whatever field they are drop. They want to see collaboration across departments that works smoothly in order to achieve bigger company KPIs. And so that those are the two things that often are more looked for as results. However, there's also just a general sense of more ease when it comes to working together and less attrition. However, that is a lot harder to actually measure because everybody feels
That's
that.
what I was about to say, right? Should measure this.
I don't know if there's any measure that is specifically for that, but clearly for the people who are involved, in the coaching, so whether it's the leader or the team, they can feel that, right? So that from a personal perspective it's very easy to say if it is smooth and easy to work with other, or if it's really hard. However, it's less measurable. That's why probably the KPIs and the quality of the relationship, maybe that's a bit easier to objectively assess.
Yeah. And you mentioned working with whole groups or teams. I know you also do group or team programs. Are there any specific examples that you'd be willing to share about how an intercultural coaching support can help a team or a group get more awareness, get better results, improve something in their working styles or performance or communication relationship?
Absolutely. I actually enjoy working with groups and teams a lot, especially if they're diverse, because one of the things that is really interesting is that when you talk about culture, and culture is just one of the factors that impacts performance and relationship. And when we talk about culture, it's very easy to focus on what the other person, quote unquote, should be doing or are doing right or is doing wrong. And in a one-on-one conversation, there is a one perspective that is the client, and then there's the rest that is kind of in a vacuum. And when you work with a group or a team, it's a lot easier to see in real life what the differences look like, because especially when you, for example, introduce a dimension like trust or decision-making or communication, it's very interesting to see what that means to everybody. And especially if the group is diverse, you can see very clearly that a lot of people have very different ideas of what good communication looks like. And there's, as always, there's no right or wrong way. However, if people are not aware that other people see things differently, that usually is a very big obstacle. So working with teams, for example, I was working with a team a couple of months ago, and we had a whole conversation about what is good feedback, because everybody always say it's important to have feedback so that we know what we're doing right. However, for a lot of people, straightforward, very direct, very transparent feedback was very hurtful because they thought it was too direct and almost aggressive. And for another part of the group, it was just the way things are, right? So when you give feedback, you give it very honestly and very straightforward. And they were not even thinking that the way they were giving feedback needed to be tweaked in order to make some of their co-workers a little bit more comfortable in receiving that feedback, which that if they were more comfortable receiving that feedback, it would have been easier for them to internalize it and then have conversations around what needs to be done next in order to change whatever they needed to be changing. So sometimes everybody says feedback is important, but we don't spend time discussing how do you want to receive feedback? How do I give feedback? And so I think that general different perspective it's a lot more rich a discussion when you work with groups and teams, for sure.
This is a beautiful example, a very specific example, this feedback giving scenario. Is that okay to explore this a little bit more? I've got a follow-up question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So as I was listening, the question that I got is, how much of this is culturally determined, in your opinion? Because different people have different communication styles, even within one culture, and we know that culture is not a kind of fixed number or a point, right, or measure. It is a spectrum, and every individual within their own culture can show more of traditional traits that are usually associated with that culture, or fewer of those, right? So now that you speak about giving feedback, how much of that is really culturally determined, or is that, you know, a matter of different individual styles and maybe preference or psychological types or upbringing or something else?
That is a great question that I started exploring a couple of years ago when I was getting a lot of intercultural requests for coaching or training or group facilitation, because culture is something that it seems very obvious to others that impacts the way that people behave. And so often, as I was saying, like cultural differences is the starting point. That usually is where the request of the clients comes from. However, when you start the work, as you can see in the background, I have the culture map. That is usually the framework that I use to have these conversations around, because it's quite straightforward. It has 8 dimensions, and you can have the 2 opposite styles, and then you can discuss. However, when you get into conversations, either with individuals or with groups and teams, there's 2 parts. The first part is exploring the self-awareness, as you were saying. So like, where do the individuals, either the individual leader or person or the individuals within the group, where do they see themselves in the continuum, which might or might not coincide with where the country culture is according to the data, right? So that is an interesting piece of information for them. So for example, let's say feedback, let's say generally speaking, it's common in China to have a tendency of giving feedback in a very negative feedback in a very indirect way, because direct negative feedback is seen as aggressive. However, I have worked with leaders and teams, especially in multinational companies, who had absolutely no problem identifying themselves as I'm very happy to give straight, honest, transparent, direct feedback, and that's my style. And that doesn't mean that it's something wrong with them. It just means that that's their style, which can be influenced by their personality trait, the company they've been working with. So clearly, if it's a more international company, they might have been exposed to a lot of different styles, their education, their leadership style, their team or department culture. So of course, there's always a conversation around national culture is a part of what influences behavior, but it's not the only part. It depends. For some people, it might be a very big part. For some people, it might be a small part. So that is the piece of around self-awareness. And the second part is, where do the other people that I'm working with stand? Again, same discussion. And where do we meet in the middle? But that kind of is important to know, because if, for example, feedback, I have a very straightforward way of giving feedback, and I think that that's the best way to give feedback. And I do that. I actually did that when I was leading a team a lot of years ago. And I was very straightforward with someone who was my senior and it was technically more experienced than me, but my very young self didn't have all this knowledge. And so I was just very straightforward, say, hey, there's a mistake here, please fix it. I also did that in front of the whole team. And a couple of days later, this person didn't show up at work and they just decided that they wanted to quit the position. And later, with lots of conversation with my peers, I recognized that that way of giving feedback was perceived as aggressive, as judgmental, as making the other person lose face, which of course was absolutely not my intention, but that is how it was perceived. And so that is one of the examples that, tells you that being aware of how other people wish to receive feedback is crucial so that you can adapt that and not having people quit, for example.
Yeah, and the sensitivity to face is really different in different cultures.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One phrase that you said early in this conversation struck me, and I want to go back to that. Sure. You said, and when many managers started to move to China, it was kind of in the air. China is difficult, right? And I think, oh, there's so much bias in the way it's phrased, right? In the way it sounds. We label something or someone, and here like the whole culture, as difficult. So what do we prepare for? Do we prepare for a fight? Do we prepare for hardship? So, and all these biases make a big impact, I think, on leadership style, on just how one feels and how one behaves in a new culture. So is there anything else that you'd like to share around biases maybe, and how intercultural coaching helps to surface some of those and ideally maybe balance them out or eliminate?
Absolutely. I think a big part of intercultural coaching, whether it's with individuals or with teams, is around self-awareness about our own assumptions, because that often is the place that we come from, whether we recognize it or not. Everyone has ideas of what a culture is, and we often border on stereotyping because of either media, because of news, because of experiences from others that we get told. And so especially the less we know about a culture, the easier it is for us to stereotype it, because our brain needs to make sense of the few information we have. And so we often come in with, this is what I know about Italy, that everybody eats pasta all the time and everybody's romantic. That's what everybody tells me all the time. And I'm like, not really. I mean, there are people who are romantic and there are people who really like pasta, but those are not the only two things that happen. And so I think, especially with China, a lot of people have ideas of what China is and isn't, and that is not necessarily based on their own personal experiences, but it's based on other people's experiences or information that they have received. And so they form a very strong opinion about what it will be to work and live in China. And so that's often a big part of the work at the beginning is, you say that your team doesn't want to work with you. Okay, where is that assumption coming from? How do you know? Have they told you, or are you reading into their behavior? What does that look like? What would it look like if it was different? What are your assumptions about how you show up with them? And so all of that, I think that the self-awareness around assumptions and the working on dismantling a little bit the assumptions, it's very important in order to be able to understand others. So intercultural work is a lot about self-awareness first, which very much is in line with the coaching approach, and then understanding others. Because if we only focus on understanding others, it's like there's a piece missing. We definitely have to start from ourselves.
So as you made this connection between self-awareness and a coaching approach, that got me thinking about a coaching mindset. I remember a few times when I was asked to deliver intercultural sessions for a global organization. I thought that sometimes when we only deliver intercultural, then participants tend to focus more on differences, although we tell them that, okay, so now the idea is to bridge the gap. The idea is to develop a flexible and adaptable approach, right? So, but I think that this idea of being different is just kind of gets deeper in participants' head when we only do intercultural. So whenever I really can negotiate this with the sponsor or the organization, I always try to invite them to consider at least 2 different workshops, and one could be about intercultural communication or intercultural leadership, right? Or about teams going global, or anything else that helps them become more aware of cultures and provide the shortcut. But on the other hand, I also suggest them to have another workshop that's around a coaching mindset, because I think that the coaching mindset training enables them to really act, on all those great ideas that we invite them to consider intercultural. So we ask them, so we invite you to be less judgmental, but it's easier said than done. So I'd really like to offer a second workshop in the series, if possible, around a coaching mindset to really help leaders get some training and experiential learning around curiosity, lack of judgment, holding space, acceptance. And this is so well trained in coach training programs that I totally love when intercultural leaders join our coach training programs, because they just naturally become more efficient in their leadership roles. What are your experiences and thoughts around this?
Absolutely. I think that is a wonderful approach. You're right, often again, because of how clients often frame it, is these people are different than these people, so we should be doing something to make them work together. And while that is not necessarily untrue, because there might be obvious differences, just the framing around that kind of reinforces the fact that, because they're different, then we have to do something to bring them together. I often start my programs, especially the group ones, with a whole discussion about biases and stereotypes, because I think that helps framing the conversations around, we're looking at differences as a trend and as a starting point, but we're not drilling down on the differences, because there's no way that we can codify what each person will be according to whatever framework we're looking at. So, and I often get questions around, well, you're saying that we shouldn't stereotype, and then we go in, well, generally speaking, people in China do that. And I was like, yes, it's a yes, and because we want to know that there are areas like communication, like feedback, like leadership, where there are trends in cultures that are different. And that is true. However, just knowing the trends doesn't mean that we have to assume that everybody's following that trend. So that's why the self-awareness is important. And on top of coaching mindset, I also sometimes, if I can, I would love to have kind of like a facilitated session, if I'm working with a team, where they take all of their learning about where the differences are and actually discuss what does that mean for them and how are they going to work around the differences. Because often it's easier to say, okay, well, these are all the differences, and then kind of leave it there. So the thing, to me, the natural next step is knowing that there are all these differences. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to have a conversation around how can we bring together our differences? Because that is a lot harder to do as, a general rule. It has to be tailored to the group or the team that is working together, because the combination of differences will always be different, right? And so what works for them might not work for others. And so if I can, I often have facilitated conversations around, okay, we know that we have 4 different ways of preferred feedback. What does it mean for us? So what is how can we decide, or what are we deciding are the ways that we give feedback to each other, so that we incorporate all of those. And often that is really, really crucial. And if I don't get to do that, I definitely encourage the leaders to hold that conversations with their own teams, so that they can figure that out and work with their teams. with a coaching mindset, with a non-judgmental offering, as in, this is where we are, where are we going next together? And that often makes a lot of difference.
Well, thank you for sharing. I think teams and leaders can talk about similarities as well in cultures, not only about difference. I think these differences it gets so much emphasis in all the intercultural kind of the context, right? And how people talk about it.
Absolutely. I think it is easier to focus on differences at the beginning, because that's where the challenges usually emerge from. However, I think it's part of that shift to focus from the challenge to the action is where are the commonalities, and how can we work together while honoring the differences. We're not just erasing the differences, because that's not how people work, but with the honoring those differences, what can we find as common points, and how can we move forward together within this context? I think that's important.
So based on your experience as an expert and intercultural coach, what do you think are some of the key character traits that someone needs to be cultivating intentionally if they want to be successful intercultural leader, or just feel happier, if they move abroad or have to live abroad?
I think curiosity is something that is always important, because it is very easy to be on the receiving end of a lot of difference, and is very easy to kind of be focusing on the differences and what is not working and what is different from whatever you grew up or whatever you were used to do. So I think that curiosity to find out what is working, or find out what do I like about this, or find out what else can I be looking into. I think that that's really, really important, both in work, but also in personal life and in social life. When you're in a different country, it is very easy to get isolated if you're not actively trying to expand your social circle or expand your range of experiences. So I think that push to be more curious can definitely make a difference. And I think that the second thing would be like a willingness to be wrong and make mistakes, because that will happen, and that's the best way to learn, and it comes with the curiosity. So curiosity to go out and do new things, or try different ways to work and communicate with people, and the knowledge that you will be wrong sometimes, and to learn. It's the way that you can use that is learning from the mistakes, and hopefully not do those again, because you've learned on your own skin, which again, it's easier said than done, but it is, I think, the key to gaining a new perspective. I think that intention of getting out there and trying new things is really, really important.
Thank you. So what suggestions would you give to a coach who is looking at the intercultural coaching niche? How can they get started in the niche? Is there any learning they need to do? Is there other experiences they need to have? Like, if someone might be interested in becoming an intercultural coach, but they don't really know what kind of preparation they might need to do for that. So what would you suggest?
Well, other than a solid coaching training, which I think it's important, for cross-culture, I think there's plenty of models that people can look up. There's, the culture map, there's a lot of others, there's Hofstede, there's a lot of others. However, I think that the frameworks are not as important as the attitude that you're going in with. So clearly, if a person has already experiences about working across culture, or leading across culture, or living and working in a different country, that is already something that they can take from from their personal experience, and that can impact the way that they're coaching. There are plenty of specific cross-cultural coach training that people can do. I think that there's a lot of often requests around specific countries. So like, for example, if people have worked in China, then they can use their own China experience to inform their how to live in China, how to work in China, how to work with Chinese teams and leaders and organizations. So that is often where the requests come from. So that is a starting point. However, in my personal experience, after doing this for quite a few years, is that is important. However, focusing too much on I only work with people that are in China or need to work with China can also be limiting, because it can translate into a lot of 10 action steps you need to do to be successful in China, and that is kind of limiting in the possibilities. So again, it can focus a lot more on the differences and what other people are doing differently, and it kind of can lack that self-awareness. So I think that it's a starting point, but then it can be expanded.
Thank you very much for sharing, Maria. That was an insightful conversation. I'm really happy that you joined today and you kind of helped us to sum up so much information about this. I know that we get questions regularly, and it's really great to have now this beautiful recording that other coaches and maybe intercultural leaders can use to at least to get some food for thought, right? There's no ready answers, there's no cookie cutter solutions, but at least some food for thought. And I'm happy that we were able to create this in this conversation, I think.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a great way to look at a lot of things that are around culture that maybe we don't often talk out loud, but they are definitely there.